Welcome to Machine Minds, where technology and humanity meet. I'm your host, Greg Tarusian, founder of Samson Rose, a recruiting and search business focused on the robotics and AI industries. The Machine Minds show is where we dive deep into the intricate world of robotics and artificial intelligence. As a staffing industry leader with a passion for the frontiers of technology, I'm pleased to be bringing you intimate conversations with the founders, investors, and trailblazers who are at the heart of the AI and robotics revolution. In each episode, we dig into their journeys, the applications of the products they're working on, and the breakthroughs that are shaping our future. Join us as we explore how these machine minds are transforming the way we live, work, and understand our world. Whether you're an entrepreneur, a tech enthusiast, or just curious about this amazing field, you'll learn something new with each episode. Let's delve into the extraordinary. Let's delve into machine minds. Hello and welcome to Machine Minds. I'm your host, Greg Tarusian, founder of Samson Rose, your robotics talent search partner. And on today's episode, I'm joined by Carson Potter, head of product at AMP. Thanks for being on the show today, Carson.
Thanks for having me, Greg.
My pleasure. Let's jump into it. So before joining AMP, what were some of the key roles and experiences that shaped your career, just to lay the foundation of this conversation?
Yeah, absolutely. I have kind of a non-traditional robotics career, which I think has turned out to be really helpful for the skill set that we need at a company like AMP. So I come mostly from software and machine learning. That was kind of my focus undergraduate. I was trained computer science, bachelor's of science, et cetera. But out of school, I did a series of startups, mostly focused on data platforms, large machine learning stuff. Was fortunate to be part of a Y Combinator company from sort of the very earliest days and get my butt kicked in the realm of starting companies. And then kind of get some more experience at scale at a larger company called Thumbtack out in San Francisco, which gave me a sense of kind of deploying models at scale and how to work with teams in a data-rich environment. In terms of robotics, me and a few friends have been fortunate to win a few grants to build installation art for places like Electric Forest. We've leased it to groups like String Cheese or Base Nectar. And that's, mostly kind of a silly, fun thing, but you do encounter a lot of the same problems that you encounter in production robotics when trying to build something that can be reliable for 72 hours straight in a hostile festival environment. So things like electromagnetic interference or like buffer overflow issues. And so that was kind of my career background coming to AMP, and then just kind of taking a focused look at joining a climate startup. I was able to sort of get involved from the perspective of software and AI and leverage some of that more founder-driven background and some of the robotics stuff to be able to be effective in this environment.
Interesting. So it sounds like those previous roles and even like your hobbies and things like that really prepared you for this current position.
More than I expected, I would say. Because I did come from like a big product background and the role before this last one. And that's a lot more sort of like directly in Jira, optimizing multivariate tests, managing a more tight execution schedule, all very valuable skills. But especially in clean energy or in the type of business that AMP works in, a lot of the product work you need to be versed in and, is obviously technologically aligned with robotics, which is that personal stuff, and then more consequentially aligned with kind of that founder general manager approach of, understanding and advancing business models. So less of the day-to-day management and more of the business side of it.
For sure. Are you still doing the art installations and things like that in your own time?
Not as much as I'd like to. I mostly fanboy my friends who are doing it more full-time at this point. So I go to the installations when they're out when I can, and then I participate in the ideation part. So I like coming up with the ideas, and then I do less and less that's actually valuable to them these days.
It's all good. Things change, right? At least you're still involved in some way.
Absolutely. And I'm blessed with the experience. Super unique chance to get involved in that kind of thing.
Yeah, for sure. So for our listeners who might not be familiar, can you give us an overview of what AMP does and the industry that you operate in?
Absolutely. So I like to say AMP is first and foremost an industrial automation platform. Practically speaking, though, we are a material identification and sortation service for the waste industry. So if you look at sort of our technology stack, it's principally a computer vision stack driven by a red, green, blue camera, but also with the ability to adopt a number of other modalities. And that software sort of computer vision stack is directly integrated with a tracking and harvesting set of algorithms that are designed to be easily extensible to different forms of automation. And so there's a lot we've done with that in terms of enabling 3 or 4 different kind of core robotic formats to sort material using that vision system as an input, as well as building increasingly sophisticated control layers and automation on top of the set of robotics we might deploy into an environment. And so that stack in principle can be extended really efficiently to virtually any environment that's benefited from computer vision style identification. But in terms of practice, AMP deploys that technology in waste processing. And so we have robots and 400 plus robots around the world, predominantly sorting on single stream recycling, municipal solid waste, organics, construction and demolition, even electronic waste. And so that's kind of our bread and butter. Lately, the way we've been selling that product is kind of an integrated environment. So offering it as a service instead of saying, hey, you can have this microwave and put it in your kitchen. We go in and we're like, hey, let's radically reimagine your kitchen. And you'll sign a contract where we're giving you exactly the meals you want at the time you want with the amount of residue or waste that you want to have after it. And we'll run that for you and achieve that outcome using our systems. So kind of a managed services approach.
That's cool. That's very cool. So it sparks a question for me though. If you're deploying these globally, how do you help support those or manage those? And do you have teams locally or partners?
Extremely challenging is the real answer.
Yeah, I bet.
And often where a lot of robotics companies come into, it's like one of the many rude awakenings you might experience as you grow is how do you manage edge devices in deployed environments, especially when you have limited control over that environment. For us, we operate principally in these facilities called MRFs, which are material recovery facilities. That's what it stands for. And the challenge with a MRF is that, some of them are in Alaska where like bearings on pulleys will freeze because it's so cold. Some of them are in Arizona where you're operating internally without air conditioning, 130 degrees plus, really high particulate matter rates, or just really gnarly environments to create a rugged product in. So we do have like a very technical, skilled service and support team, replete with install technicians, customer service groups, but also process engineers who are really dedicated to being able to diagnose, again, in a highly analytical way, what's going wrong. And so it's a mixture of working with distributors in some regions, expanding those roles in some regions where we have enough of a presence, and then ultimately keeping that kind of continuous dialogue between our operations team and our technology team on how can we make their job more proactive. So a simple example might even just be the way we've extended the use of our computer vision algorithm to detect if certain problems are present on the robot. For example, how effectively it's grasping, or if there's like a hose loose or something. And these are not actually part of our core IP of telling what type of recyclable item is on a belt, but uses the same skill sets to make service like a manageable problem.
Yeah, interesting. This is really unique way of integrating the different technologies there, and then obviously the highlighting if there's any issues. So do you install the robot as well as the computer vision stack, or is that a separate?
Yes. So in most cases, we develop our own robotics, though when you think about robotics, a lot of what we're automating is not, like a humanoid robot. Sometimes it's as simple as a series of solenoid valves that are triggered with very particular timing. In one case, the case of our Delta robot, we work with a robotics provider, Omron. And so, when we actually have kind of that moving component, that is sort of a preferred partnership that we manage and work closely with them to sometimes even extend the capabilities of what they do. So we, we'll basically get in rooms with them and figure out how to overclock their robots. But yeah, it's definitely a challenge for maintenance. And I think in some ways is a trend I've seen in the robotics industry, where I've seen companies, in like the parking automation space, or even the like automated painting and window cleaning space, where in their Series B, they were selling the product and continue to do so, but they realized there's kind of this distribution of performance environments, and if you're in that middle section, your product is really optimal, but when you sell it to people, they don't have a good sense of what that distribution is and when they're outside of it. And so they'll put it into environments where the robot's performance is no longer sort of achieving those like far greater than status quo or market outcomes. Whereas if they invert that model and they go to market and they're like, hey, we'll actually just sell you a window cleaning service, or we'll buy your parking lot and manage it for you, they find that they can keep the operating environment within sort of the optimal distribution for the automated technology. And so they're able to deliver that value to the customer as a margin instead of trying to manage a technology that might be harder for the customer to set up for success.
Yeah, interesting. Interesting. So what's the mission of AMP, and how do you see the company contributing to the, obviously first the sortation industry, but then wider robotics and AI? Because these partnerships, the tech you're developing and stuff like that, it's all really, really relevant and interesting.
That's a really good question. I'll take the first part of that first because it's a little easier.
Yeah, sorry, it's a
All good.
two-part
All
question.
good. So internally, we often use the slogan like a world without waste. I think the more practical way to think about it is you have sort of this cost profile of virgin materials. And you could say that's $10 a ton to make something out of a virgin feedstock. Obviously, that number changes a lot if it's a different type of plastic or metal or a certain product. But for this argument, let's say it's $10. Today, in most contexts, using a recycled feedstock is going to be like $12 or $15. And the reason for that is that there's, the waste models that are available to us with the technologies today have this large, call it like 40% cost chunk of that $12. So, $4 of that or whatever is just the cost to sort the material, to process it into a refined feedstock that can be used for manufacturing again. Another, $4 to $5 of that is transport, which somewhat unintuitively can be affected by the technology, because the smaller and more efficient you can get, the more you can reduce the amount of transport between areas. And then the last bit of that cost is actually just the recycling conversion. And so the way I think about AMP's mission is like we're here to attack the heart of that unit economic problem. Like we want to take that $12 and make it cheaper than the $10 for virgin. And if you do that, a lot of really exciting things start to happen, because waste goes from being this large sort of like infrastructure taxpayer burden to this really valuable feedstock source, this thing that can be used in clean energy and circularity globally. And there's, estimates vary, but there's like about $200 to $300 billion of material value just essentially buried into the ground each year. And so our goal is to unlock that latent value, make it profitable to use these feedstocks, and hopefully in doing so, drive a really substantial climate impact.
Wow. Wow. Those are big numbers. That's a lot that's buried there.
That's why I struggled with your second question of, and what do we want to do after? Yeah. It's like, well, waste is such a huge problem. It's just like this quiet underbelly of climate that we don't have a lot of internal dialogue about like what next. It's like, well, if we can figure this one out, that'll be good enough. But to your point, there are certainly ways we can extend the platform into other forms of sort of like low cost processing of materials, where you need a highly adaptable sensor set, which, in the form of AI is extremely manageable.
Sure. Do you know the founding story, or how the idea came up?
I do. So we were founded about 10 years ago by Dr. Matanya Horowitz. I just call him Matanya, but he was got a bunch of degrees, undergraduate, went to Caltech, was working on his PhD there, was very focused on robotics, but this was around 2012. AlexNet, saw the sort of beginning of the AI movement, and was trying to find a way to sort of combine those interests into a practical business model. So he did sort of an industry walkabout and looked at a bunch of different areas. Ultimately, really settled on recycling as an area where there were like severe labor shortages. There were sort of underperformance issues, and this at least this first problem of like a robot arm to pick certain items in a particularly like high injury, low retention part of the plant where people are manually doing that otherwise, stuck out as a reasonable opportunity that intersected with his skill set. So he spent 5 or 6 years working on that problem as part of the PhD, with a few people as part of an early NSF and SBIR style funded company. So just really kind of the early R&D phases. And then around 2016, 2017, we started putting units out in the world, selling units, and have grown to about 400 systems or a little bit over that globally since then. So it's been sort of this trajectory of 4 to 5 years of really focused R&D, getting a product out there, iterating on it and expanding it, and then starting to find more, maybe more impactful ways to leverage the same sets of technology to drive greater outcomes in the industry. And that's why you see us now like rebranded as AMP and having more of a focus on these like integrated facilities. We think that's kind of the culmination of how how to make a difference in this sector with this technology.
Yeah. What sets AMP's technology apart from other solutions in the market? Or I'm assuming like the traditional way is probably just humans standing over this conveyor belt doing it.
Yeah, there's almost, to your point, there's almost two classes of answer. There's sort of like, what is the status quo or the last generation of infrastructure? And then how do we differentiate from others who are, building similar or advanced technologies for waste? In the first case, the former, it is really, as you noted, a lot of systems that rely on heavy industry equipment. So like big screens and large, picture like rotating axes with like gears on them and big heavy things like that will move some material apart. That stuff can be really high maintenance, a little dangerous, pretty power hungry. So in some cases, we directly try to replace that with something more adaptable and more lightweight. And then, in other cases, there are tons of recycling systems around, all of the cities you and I have been in that are literally just, like 20, 30, 40 people over conveyor belts in various parts of the plant, just grabbing certain things out. And so really trying to put that into a more cost efficient place and to reduce labor exposure to one of the few environments where it's like a job that people really typically don't want. And then, so on the second side of that, there's kind of how do we differentiate from other players in this space? In terms of marketing positioning, it can be hard to tell on collateral, but for me, a lot of it is like scale and results. So there are a number of startups who, within a few years of AMP coming out with these products, have started similar positioning. So like AI characterization companies or robot arm companies. Some of them have found niches that are a little different than AMP. Maybe they're a little lower cost or things like that. But the two things that I think set us apart are, one is scale. Like we talked about this a little bit ago, but it's very different having 5 robots out in the world than having 300 robots out in the world. The infrastructure needed to do that reliably is just essentially a different company at that size, and accordingly, AMP does iterate really often on the platform through which we support these things, including our AI sees over 80 billion items a year, and that allows us a really robust sort of available corpus to train against, and allows us to really iterate on the AI's capabilities. And so I think that shows up in terms of the reliability of the units, but also sort of in a more subtle way that I could get into, but it's basically the AI is, I think, significantly better than a lot of our sort of competitors who claim to have similar feature sets. And that just comes down to like an F1 score of the model on different labels and having more nuanced categorizations. On the performance side, I talked a little bit about the AI, but the rest of it is just, having battle tested equipment, running our own facilities where we're under contract to achieve certain levels of performance. We can't get by on just being like up to 95% pure or up to 95% recovered. It's like we really have to put our money where our mouth is and dial the crap out of these things. And so we've done that in a lot of cases.
That's really cool. 2 things I want to ask off the back of that. One is, you mentioned, a point I want to make, I guess, first. Everyone knows, especially on the AI side, especially computer vision, data is really like a differentiator. The data set that you're using to train your models, train your systems and everything like that, and having the amount that you do real world, it's not simulated, it's not like using third party, it's your own, and you can categorize it and however you need to and see fit is obviously going to have you propelling forward faster and better than others. So it makes total sense. Off the back of that, are there any recent like innovations or breakthroughs that you can share or that you guys have achieved that you can share?
Yeah, definitely. So we have recently announced a facility in Virginia that is sorting municipal solid waste. And on the surface, if you visit it, it often looks a little bit like some of the technologies you see in the industry. And I think that's something we're really proud of, is it's like this elegant, very small format package that can do this thing that's sort of eluded the industry for like 15, 30 years. We hear people at some of these waste major, like the sort of large companies that do most of your hauling and landfilling, anecdotally tell us they've spent hundreds of millions of dollars trying to solve this problem. And obviously, they haven't had access to AI for that, but we're blessed to have 3 or 4 different research partnerships with the Department of Energy, sort of grants focused on really adapting this tech to that. And it's culminated in kind of a facility where we are effectively, running this material, separating out the recyclables, conditioning the organics for some sort of conversion downstream, be that, the simple things might be composting or making renewable natural gas, but there are fancier things you can do with that material. And doing it like very effectively. It's low cost, it's very small and can fit inside of waste infrastructure, and it's consistently up. So that's a big thing is, plants that typically try to run not your recycling but your trash stay up, call it 50 to 60% of the time of their scheduled hours. We're up 90. And the way we do all of that. Go ahead.
Yeah, why is it only 50 or 60%?
It has to do with the sort of the challenges of that material. Like there's a lot of like trash bags and challenging things that can stretch. There's also a lot of methods for processing it that involve heavy contact with the material. So when you get like a wayward plate weight or like an engine block, or like, think about whatever you threw out that you were throwing out and you're like, I don't really know if they're going to want this in the trash bin. Like those things show up.
I'll put it in anyway.
Yeah, exactly. Or like, where else do I put it? So building a system that can really be as contactless as possible and allow handling a lot of that stuff elegantly, and then can use a lot of this data to do smart things like detect when what we call a jam is forming. So like materials building up in one spot. So we have a bunch of different smart ways to notice when that's happening and to clear it through just kind of aggregating a systems level view of that camera data in every part of the plant. So if we know exactly what's coming through at this point or sort of at the front, and then what's in it, and then what's now downstream of one sorting device and then downstream of another, you can start to infer a lot about what's happening in the system.
Nice.
So yeah, it's kind of a package answer, but I think that's the most innovative thing AMP has done, because it just takes all of the parts and puts them together into something that's greater than their sum.
It's very cool. Before I forget, the other thing that I did want to ask is about the business model, because you mentioned a couple of things. One is like buying the system, implementing it, and then the other one is like you going in and running it. And we know something we've spoken about a lot is like one of the main hurdles for robotics companies is how you price it, how you get into, especially more, I don't want to say archaic, but older school, set in their ways industries, and having them adopt technology and stuff like that. So how do you price it? How do you partner with your customers and, get over some of the initial hurdles?
It's a great question. And frankly, it's something I've had to learn a lot about in this role too. If anything, just because of the industry being so idiosyncratic. But so when we're selling, it's a bit of pricing to market and it's a bit of pricing to the alternative. So those are usually kind of one and the same, but it's like if we're selling a whole factory, we know roughly what sort of the dollar per ton processing cost targets of the industry are. We know roughly what the typical bid rate for a certain capability is from a sort of a non-AI competitor or a non-automation competitor. And of course, they're still using a mix of tools, things like infrared sensors and other techniques that have their place and we could go into. But the main point is you understand the scope of their capabilities and the scope of their cost, and then we usually price to win against that. On the managed services side, it gets a little more nuanced because it really depends on who your client is. But it sort of boils down to what is the cost to dispose of that material in the region? What is the willingness to pay from the tax base for a solution that is maybe better for the climate or high diversion? And then what are the incentives in that area? And this can be as true for trash as it is for your blue bin recycling programs, where different regions will have different major processors doing the hauling, different cost structures, different diversion mandates or like state incentives. And so all of those things kind of come together into a view of like what is a winning economic scenario. And so that's usually how we usually do some bottoms up costing there, apply a margin to it, but then try to make sure we're doing that within the context of all of those variables I just outlined.
Got it. Okay, cool. Thank you for that. Let's switch gears. Yeah, I know. I bet it's not an easy thing to overcome and not a simple answer at all. So thanks for sharing. I wanted to switch gears and talk about product, more specifically the product function. Not every company has them, and I want to talk about, from your perspective, because obviously you're head of product, the importance of a product focused function. It means something, product can mean something different, slightly different in every company. And I want you to explain like what it means for AMP, and then your perspective and opinion on having that, as well as, your engineering team, and sometimes they roll in marketing and etc. So floor is yours. Please
Absolutely.
share.
Well, you hit the nail on the head with like no two product jobs are the same. So I definitely, there is a blueprint in Silicon Valley for the product manager, particularly within like high scale software companies, that I think is maybe the most consistent version of that role. And I've spent some time in that type of world. Um, but I think when you look at hardware in particular, and robotics, and in particular also clean energy, I think the role takes on very different meaning, and probably in a way that's very different per company. At AMP, we do have an element of sort of that traditional iterative road mapping where we set up KPIs with the company, we establish what our goals are, and we work with the engineers to really help them internalize the constraints, the requirements, the goals. Sometimes that's more conversational. If it's a more complicated set of work, that's going to be a traditional PRD and kind of driving alignment across the org in that way. The part that I think is the biggest difference is culturally, maybe out of necessity, maybe just as a function of the type of work we're doing. We do a lot less of the sort of like in Jira style management, setting story points or like writing out like, here's how you're going to do your tasks. And I think that can be really high consequence and really high value at a company like Google or Uber, where it's, you have this massive scale of software, and getting the framing exactly right on a piece of text or on a certain click-through experience can be the difference in like 0.5% of conversion, which is, tens of millions of dollars. And so I understand why that exists, but in our type of role, we try to really filter a lot of that autonomy down to the engineers. And I think in that sense, it looks a little bit more culturally like a Tesla or something, where the engineers are expected to take responsibility for understanding the problem and owning the outcome. And our job is primarily to be a resource in that process. And where we spend our time instead is a lot more on the business side. So sort of almost like a pseudo general manager. It's like, how is your project model going to be positioned? What are those pricing parameters? If you're able to use this, mousetrap to convert raw waste into a bunch of different chemical configurations, what are the right ones, and what are the commercial partnerships you need to have, and who's going to receive that material, and are they ready for that testing and validation? And so I end up doing a lot of stuff that's a little bit more general management oriented, and then a lot of stuff that's a little bit almost like a founding systems engineer, where it's like, you don't want me doing the actual math on your mass and energy balance, but I'm trying to figure out at a high level, like, are the economics of a given project model going to work? And that's true for everyone on my team to a reasonable degree.
That's really interesting. Yeah, very interesting. And I think food for thought for other founders and leaders about how they structure that, or what they task their product teams with as well. And, I know we have aspiring founders or early stage first time founders as well that haven't even built those orgs yet. So it's great to hear what people are doing and how it differs at different places.
If they're in a hardware or particularly a climate sector, and they're looking at a role like this, I would encourage them to look for those kinds of former founder, high slope generalist type participants, because I can, think through a ton of different climate companies that I really admire, like a Lilac Solutions or something, or a Pachama, or I think they often end up in positions where, especially with such a new industry, so much of what they need help with is figuring out really good ways to deploy and monetize and standardize that process of building infrastructure. And that's a very different archetype than somebody coming in and helping you kind of tweak your product to get it to a slightly more attractive phase.
Yeah, makes sense. Totally makes sense. How does it ensure that the product actually remains at the forefront of innovation? I'm sure it's like some crazy balancing act with what your clients need and
It's
the
relentless
industry.
curiosity mostly.
Really?
Like I spend a lot of time with our engineers, and there's a really healthy dialogue on, and sort of a really healthy dialogue on the technology side of our core capabilities. So like, what is the state of the art in AI? What is the state of the art in automation? What are different concepts that could translate into like meaningfully different unit economics, coming back to that example of sort of dollar per ton performance. And so that's a really important part of it. And you need to, encourage the engineers to go discover those things at the leadership levels on their own, while also staying current and updated, and oftentimes helping connect the dots. So we'll I've helped set up some like advisorships with folks who know a lot more about ML than maybe our team, and trying to find those ways to just continue helping the culture grow and adhere to maybe the innovations of people outside of our org. And then on my end personally, it's very similar where it's, we do a ton of work with the national labs. We spend a good amount of our time each week, probably like 10 to 20%, just talking to groups outside of AMP that are working on innovative ways to handle this material. And so it's like, you really need to understand the supply chain and the market and what kind of technologies are going to end up validating like a fundamentally transformative way to handle this stuff. So from my perspective, if you're doing my job well, you have a really good handle on what's coming industry wise. And then you also have a foot in the technology component well enough to be valuable in terms of how you steer the engineering team on that stuff based on the market.
Perfect. Yeah, you answered some of my next questions as well, because I really wanted to understand like how you guys kind of foster that collaborative environment and innovation when you have different teams like that. Because some people are just like, everything's under engineering, but I'm sure in a product focused role with an engineering team and with external inputs as well, you really need to have clear collaboration and a good, whether it's way of working or either embedded way of working really, and communicating across these different departments to make sure you're all aligned.
Absolutely. And that's something we're kind of always working on ourselves, because every org has different incentives in a sense. And, I represent a lot of the commercial interests of the company. So I like to joke sometimes that I'm like the greedy, business goblin, like coming in being like, how do I get this value as quickly as possible? But, naturally, like we have an operations team that we're blessed to have as like sort of our primary customers. And we've structured in a way where they have some very technical people in their organization who can really serve as that bridge and help sort of coordinate and execute tests. But that allows us to be like very sort of like candidly accountable to them on how the products are working. And also it allows us to be in an environment where we can really close that test and iteration loop super quickly, because, we do have this large customer base, but in many cases, when it comes to these facilities, like that is our team operating it. And so those are customers we have unlimited access to, and vice versa. So that allows us to—
and incentives are aligned, I'm sure.
Yeah. And I think that allows us to balance that tension of an operating team that wants a repeatable, reliable system that isn't changing around them all the time, but also having the kind of ease of deployment and ease of dialogue that allows me to come in and, push them on like, hey, this one part should actually be way more cost efficient. And so let's really think outside the box on how we can change it. And the engineering team to come in and be like, hey, here's the 5 tests we want to run. How do we set these up in a quick time frame? And I think that kind of pairing and holding people accountable to the person on the ground, the operator at the end of the day is really important. I love the way like Hadrian has talked about this, where they talk about like essentially taking a manufacturing professional and pairing an engineer with them and having them try to automate the easier parts of their job in a way that's like very collaborative.
Yeah, that makes sense. Let's switch gears and talk about the industry as a whole, because obviously you are talking to loads of interesting people. I'm sure you've got your ear to the ground on technology and trends and stuff like that. What kind of trends and tech in the robotics and AI space are you most excited about or interested in?
So I don't know enough to sound knowledgeable on these topics, but the ones that interest me the most are really kind of the increasing prevalence of like computer vision foundation models, or in some cases the use of LLMs with multimodal capabilities to do automated labeling. Because there are concepts that can be very hard to distill down to a repeatable process for an annotation workflow on an image, especially in an imaging environment that requires domain specialization, like recycling. Like, is this a food grade piece of material with this color and style of closure, this type of wrapper? There's like really nuanced things that involve understanding the supply chain. And I think, I see in those technologies the ability to essentially like train once in terms of pointing a model at where it needs to acquire that expertise, and then have it be a first round of labeling. So things like that for scaled annotation and training, as well as some of the foundation computer vision stuff that leads to more zero shot capabilities. I think both of those are areas we want to keep an eye on. Another one has been sparsity. So this has been happening with LLMs with like 4.0 and some of these others, but the same thing is happening in computer vision. Numenta does really good work here too, where just people are finding incredibly more efficient ways to have neural nets work. And that really matters for a company that's dealing with like GPU melting temperatures with edge deployments. Like the more efficient and cool we can run and achieve the same classification outputs, the better. And to a certain limit, you can start to stack multiple models or multiple devices onto one server or one GPU, and that's very exciting for just like in a deployed context.
Very cool. Where do you see your industry or AMP in general heading in the next sort of 5 to 10 years?
That's a great question. For the waste industry, I feel like the biggest adjustment will be, for the longest time, waste has been, I don't want to say burden, but it's sort of like a taxpayer responsibility. And these companies have stepped up and essentially function as utilities, like a waste management or a waste connections. And often when you talk to them, I feel like they view themselves as like a public servant in that way, which is positive. They're like, we are providing this critical, essential service where we remove this really challenging material from people's houses and homes. And I think as a case in point, back in the 90s and 80s when the mafia was primarily running tri-state area waste, like pre-RICO, they would literally stop picking it up if the like law enforcement would crack down on them or anything, and it would create a public health crisis in a period of days. So I think what I'm excited for and hopeful for is that the industry, on the backs of technologies like AMP and other sort of innovative ways to make the material valuable, will transition from this thing that's like this sort of burden to handle and to bury into this, and frankly, this large carbon source or emission source, into something that's actually a carbon negative industry. And so it's not only like, hey, we've stopped methane from coming from landfills, but it's actually like this is this massive source of biomass that can be used to sequester carbon. And this is this massive source of renewable feedstocks that are onshore and domestic and usually scale with the size of the population center that can be used to produce carbon negative advanced energy supply chain materials or construction materials. And that's kind of all there in the material. It's just a question of finding a profitable way to make that work.
Interesting. So that's like future goals and future state for sure. If we're talking a little bit closer to home, what are some of the future or closer term, shorter term goals and projects that AMP's got coming up or
Sure.
you can talk about?
Not to be facetious, but kind of that, right? Like we're bidding into regions today with these are breaking ground in 2027 style projects where we are trying to divert, call it up to 75 or 80% of the material that would go to the landfill and make recycled aluminum, recycled plastics, soda bottles, but also synthetic crude oil and carbon sequestration products and like renewable natural gas. And that's sort of like in scope today. It's not. Yeah. It's by no means assured, but it is very much where our R&D roadmap is, and also where we're bidding into market.
That's amazing. That is amazing. 2027 is literally around the corner.
Yeah, here's hoping.
So, yeah, that's cool. That's great. I did not expect that. Awesome.
It's one of these things that's very close to being at a critical point, you might say, like a turning point.
You talking about that as an industry or just as a need for the world?
Yes, both for sure. I think from a regulatory perspective, from an EPA perspective, if we still have a similar environment to what we have right now in 2 or 3 years, there will be an incredible amount of pressure to find these solutions. The government has a pointed strategy on sort of onshoring critical supply chains, and this dovetails with that, and then it also dovetails with methane management, emissions management. So I think that environment is lining up, and then there are tons of, if you look at sort of like just the individual puzzle pieces, there's tons of really interesting technologies that are doing parts of this problem, and in some cases have succeeded, in some cases just were off base on 1 or 2 key parts of their project and went under. But AMP is really hoping that we can be a platform that kind of helps connect those things, because we have this massively adaptable machine that can help you get the little bits that you need out of that garbage to make something useful. And so we feel pretty good about some of the project models we've pulled together. But I do think, whether or not it's us, I hope we're doing it, and I hope we're doing it 5 years ahead of when it would otherwise happen. But I do think it's maybe closer than a lot of people realize.
Yeah. It is a lot closer than I thought. That's for sure. How do you plan to keep AMP at the cutting edge of tech and innovation? Is it something that you're leading or involved with yourself or the team?
I think so. We talked a little bit about culture earlier. I think on the engineering side, I'm always trying to help them find access to opportunities to learn and flagging things that are interesting to me as somebody who's, I don't know, like loosely integrated into what's happening in the world on AI and robotics. So I won't claim to be doing anything super helpful for them other than, being a guy who's like, hey, did you see this? Did you see this? And I rely on that culture for them to similarly be improving how we approach things. On my end, I think it really comes back to that framing of, what are the versions of this that create the most value. You can almost take a first principles view on it, which is like, what is the most energy and carbon efficient way to produce the most durable, valuable good out of every part of the buffalo that is, the trash in your landfill. And that's a never ending journey, because it's, I'm blessed to be able to kind of walk across these different national lab communities, these different scientific communities where you're learning about, custom enzymes that do this, that produce ethanol or lactic acid or these other, intermediates that turn into big, beautiful products. And so, from my perspective, the way we stay on the cutting edge of that is that we are, no good ideas in the building. Like, we are constantly out there. We are participating in the federal R&D community, the scientific community. We are using our technology as a platform to advance that research, because a lot of these groups, they get stuck on that part of like, how do I get a feedstock that looks a little bit like what I need? And we're like, hey, we have this, mouse, we punch a few buttons in and we can give you something that's mostly what you need. And so just continuing to play that role in the sort of space of R&D, and then to continue to find and integrate those types of capabilities and validate them, is how I think we'll stay ahead of this. Because to your point on the future, I would love to not only be in a place in 5 years where we are demonstrating a model that can replicate, nationally around high diversion from landfill. I would love to be in a place where we're actually needing to compete with other people who are like, not only can we do that, but we can make a more valuable product out of that. We're not going to make natural gas. We're going to make sustainable jet fuel. And we're like, oh crap, we have to step up our game to make sure that we're getting the highest and best use out of this material.
Very cool. Yeah, that's so true. It's really interesting as well. I guess anyone who wasn't aware of the industry or the work that you do probably wasn't aware of like all the things that you could make from waste and the impact that can have, the greater impact that can have. So yeah, it's thought-provoking and also inspiring. Kind of want to help however you can, really. And
absolutely. And on the recycling side, it's more just continuing to drive lower costs to create that more profitable nature. So not just municipal solid waste, but finding recycling systems that are smaller, more automated, lower costs, safer, and that get more of that material back into the supply chain.
Yeah, definitely. We touched on this before about the ways the industry is currently doing it, right? There's big clunky machinery, or there's people doing it and stuff like that. There's often the debate about the impact of AI and automation on jobs. What's your perspective on this, especially in the context of AMP's work?
I think it's a really important conversation to have as a society, especially because it's not always going to be predictable the places that AI affects most in terms of labor force. And so there's this common trope that it's like, oh, they're automating away these, jobs that people need to sort of like build their wealth. But if, like large language models continue on this trend, I think like one of the most disrupted areas will be the knowledge economy, which is kind of a totally different segment of labor than I think people think about when they look at the history of automation and labor displacement. And so I think it's important in general that we view, that we kind of continue to talk about the areas in which these technologies might impact individuals, and how as a society we want to support and transition those individuals. I think AMP is by and large fortunate to be working in a space where we are mostly providing a net positive upgrade. And that happens kind of in two ways. One is within a manufacturing context, this is by far the highest injury laden sector. It also has just this incredible, like greater than 60% churn rate in a lot of the positions we're automating. And so many words, it's very hard to find and retain labor that wants to stand over a conveyor belt moving, 200 feet per minute all day, pulling unsafe garbage out with heavily protected gloves in a super hot environment at, low to minimum wage. So that's a position where we are often taking those positions and maybe reducing the total number of them, but the people who are now in the facility are reviewing data, working closely with advanced technology, making decisions about how to configure and run the plant. And so we're able to, as we've done internally, take people who came in an operator position and see them grow into prototyping engineers or plant managers who are like have these very impressive pedigrees in terms of their ability to work with advanced technology and data. And so in a lot of our projects, we talk about how this may reduce the net number of jobs in that area, but it's doing it in a class of work that's like very undesirable and dangerous, and translating it into higher paying, upskilled jobs.
Yeah, it's a common theme as well. We talk about like putting people in better roles, allowing them to do more valuable, more thought-provoking, more mentally challenging things with their time, instead of like the dull, dirty, dangerous things that at the end of the day create high turnover as well for the businesses, So if you're able to keep your staff on and give them a way of upskilling and let them do something a little bit more with their time and their career than they didn't even think was possible before, in the long term, it's going to be better for everyone. And your facility gets so much more efficient, right? You're able to do so.
That's the other point I was going to make is, these robots will work 24/7 and maintain their performance over time. And that's compared to, the end of someone's 8-hour shift, hand picking garbage. To your point, not only does it have those labor outcomes, but that translates into a meaningful environmental outcome for the performance of those recycling sort of environments.
100%. Yeah. Look, Carson, it's been a pleasure speaking with you. As we wrap up, what advice do you have to aspiring technologists in the robotics and AI fields?
It's a great question. I'm a big fan of this theme that like the biggest problem or the biggest gap in humanity is one of agency. And maybe that's just like the week in the news I've been seeing. But from my perspective, I came from a background that doesn't really translate, like if you look at a resume, into what I'm doing now. And I think for me, it just took like being very intentional about going and building a side project here and there, kind of relentlessly looking at companies that lined up with my values and the technology I wanted. And then once you get here, just like busting your butt, like really just going and figuring out what is going to make this thing work. And so I think people underestimate their ability to go do that. And so I don't think you need to find some specific alchemy of how to get involved. I think you just need to start doing things, pick a project you like. If you have a certain technology you like, just start making stuff and talking to people and getting yourself in front of the companies that might want to work with you. And that will breed opportunities. And then from there, seize them.
Love that. I love that. Maybe not as relevant for people in their career, deeper in their career, but I tell students all the time, like, get active with your free time, get into the project teams, get into some sort of extracurricular stuff, whether it's a project you're doing on your own, or like a startup that you want to work with, or internships, or whatever it may be, free work, to put yourself in the position and gather the knowledge, and then also the network to position you for a role. And like you said, if you're doing it as a hobby, if you're doing it whatever, it's going to get you there eventually. That's the goal anyway. Yeah. How can our listeners keep up with your work and interact with you, follow you and the developments of AMP?
That's a great question. I think, primarily we have our website, ampsortation.com. We're on every social media platform like LinkedIn and X and Instagram. We occasionally post YouTube videos. If they want to talk to me, I would reach out to me. That's like Carson@ampsortation.com. I don't talk about a lot of this stuff on social because I'm more of a show your results, don't talk about your work in progress kind of thing. So it's I'm kind of quiet online. But I'd be happy to answer questions about AMP or about navigating into a climate or AI and robotics career if anyone listening is interested. Perfect. Thank you. Oh, before we go, for our YouTube viewers, let's see your t-shirt, because we did that before. Okay, so I wore one of AMP's branded t-shirts today, which says "Turning Trash into Cash" and has a little robot throwing dollar bills out of a dumpster. Love that. It's so cool. I think I need to get one. All right, Carson, look, thank you so much again. I really appreciate it. And I'm looking forward for this episode to come out and everyone to hear about all the cool stuff you guys are doing. Likewise. Thank you for having me, Greg. My pleasure.